Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Welcome. Our guest today is Dr. Patrick Hotle. He is the chair of History and Foreign Language Department at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri, where he teaches world civilizations, the Middle East, the age of the Crusades, medieval Europe, and classical Greece and Rome. Dr. Hotle helped establish the Study Abroad program at Culver Stockton and has taken students to a host of nations, including England, Italy, Russia, and where our discussion will center on today, Turkey. He is an award-winning historian and professor who was one of only 19 faculty members from around the United States to make a presentation in 2016 at a seminar in Washington, D.C. that focused on Herodotus, the ancient Greek writer often referred to as the father of history. He is experienced and well-traveled, having taught in many places around the globe, such as the Netherlands, Belgium, Egypt, Nicaragua, and Iowa. Welcome, Dr. Hodl.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, this is such an interesting topic to me, and we focused a lot on local history or Lincoln history, and that happens around here. Sure. So I think this is a great change of pace.
Yeah. Well, the links between historical periods and locations are often kind of surprising. That the Byzantine Empire and American history, there's probably more links than we might think. So we might as well talk about that.
I think so too. Dr. Hodl, it's tradition here to accompany our conversation with a special brew.
Oh, yes.
Remembering the Germanic hordes that descended on the Roman Empire, our selection today is a German beer, Schnickelfritz, Bavarian-style Weiss beer ale from Urban Chestnut Brewing Company in St. Louis. This ale won first place in the 2017 Great International Beer, Cider, Mead, and Sake competition. Urban Chestnut products are available at Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. And remember, you can suggest a feature beer for a future episode. Just subscribe to the History A Go-Go podcast, like our Facebook page, and leave a comment. If your beer is selected, you'll receive a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee. So subscribe wherever you get your podcast and leave a review. So Dr. Hodl, we'll get to the Byzantine Empire, but let's go back to Rome for a second. And at the end of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, that ended about 2 centuries of Pax Romana, the Roman Empire started to decline for various reasons, including hostile enemies all across their borders, political upheaval, economic problems. The military had issues with, relying too heavily on mercenaries and non-Romans. So Diocletian attempts to reform the Roman Empire in 284, should we say CE or AD?
CE, I guess, is the contemporarily preferred version. So, yeah, CE.
So 284 CE. What steps did he take to stabilize a really troubled empire?
Well, I think he, there was always a tendency amongst the Roman emperors to move towards the autocratic. It was really Diocletian who adopted a sort of Eastern despotic idea with all the trappings of what we think of today of the sort of mystical monarchy and making much of the emperor as more than a mere human being. So apparently at the time they were even sort of using some of the ideas that the Persians had already had relied upon for years and years. And of course it was Diocletian who also really began to think in terms of, and this was a pretty important one, the empire was so big,
right,
and impractical, and facing all the challenges that you just listed there, it's made really good sense to divide it, which of course is highly relevant to what we're going to be talking about a bit later on. And so it was Diocletian who came up with the idea of an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire. And at the time then, he even had the idea, it was called a tetrarch. There was the main emperor, and then they were each assisted by, I think they were called, I think the main emperor was called an Augustus, and the assistant emperor was called the Caesar. And the theory was that you would then have these 4 different sort of administrators as in a way, helping to manage things together, as opposed to one emperor trying to cover huge amounts of territory.
So he divides it, but that doesn't change the fact that these emperors at the time were trying to consolidate their power. So we get to Constantine in around 300 CE, and he's the one that has more impact on our discussion today, which would be Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Sure. So what does he do to try to consolidate his power?
Well, it's real interesting, with whenever you study Roman history, Byzantine history, any period really, you always deal with the mythology of the era. And there's certainly plenty of that to try to wade through. The further back you go, the more mythology you have to sort of cut your way through. It looks like today historians tend to think that Constantine was he was one of these one of the four ruling the empire, and he made a bid actually to make a long story short, to run the whole empire.
Right.
This famous battle against on the right outside Rome on the bridge that often shows up in the artwork later on of the Romans falling into the river, the Melvian Bridge, I think that's called. Anyway, he probably was an ambitious man. He may have been. It's hard to know about what was going on behind the scenes there to some degree. Of course, the tradition in Christianity makes much of Constantine's conversion just before this great battle, in which famously he sees in the sky before the battle a cross that now we would call Constantine's cross. And he then becomes this champion in the Christian version. And after all, those were our sources. Eusebius is our main source for Constantine's life, was his main biographer. And Eusebius was just gushed over Constantine. And of course, Eusebius was a bishop. And so he saw Constantine as carrying through sort of a divine project to bring the empire together and to eventually Christianize it. We know now that though that's the tradition of Constantine, the great Christian emperor, we know that in fact he really he was a very practical. There was probably a good reason why he was very successful, because he was very savvy, and he wasn't in a position didn't want to alienate his pagan subjects yet. So the issue of his conversion is always an interesting one, and much is made of the fact that it really wasn't supposedly until his deathbed that he actually was baptized. That's how I remember it, right? But his mother was. But his mother, yeah. So the tradition that Saint Helena was a good Christian, but he managed the empire well. He probably a better way to think about Constantine as the Christian empire was as a Christian emperor is Constantine as a tolerant emperor who was prepared to tolerate the Christians along with the pagans. And it was only at the very end that he actually showed sign of real preference. Famously, and here we're working our way around to the city of Constantinople. Right. He took a previously established city that went way back into it was a noted Greek city, back in the 3rd, 4th century BCE, and he took Byzantion and turned it into his own capital. That's what it eventually turned into, certainly his city. And we know, for instance, that in some of the early buildings that he built there apparently were a couple pagan temples, because he was trying to make an attractive city that would represent all of Rome in Constantinople. So he was a savvy, clever, smooth operator. Could be quite ruthless. All those it's a perfect combination for a successful emperor.
I'm not sure if this is true, but and maybe I'm remembering the history wrong, but was there a thought? Did he have a thought that he might locate the capital and rebuild the ancient city of Troy, but then chose Byzantium instead? Or am I wrong about that?
No, that's right. The idea was, and I guess there are myths that and every step of the way with Constantinople, which was kind of the secret for its success and its and the reverence towards which the world, at least the Mediterranean world, looked towards Constantinople, was that everything about it has a sort of mythological story that connects it to some decision by God to find the perfect location for a Christian city. So there's a tradition that he wanted to build it on Troy, but and I forget exactly the story, but he got some sort of vision or was encouraged somehow to relocate instead to Byzantion. And there was a good reason why he went to the site of the old Byzantium, or what we know as Constantinople. You know, all you have to do is look at a map to know that if you are trying to manage a vast empire, it is a brilliant location. It's got water on two sides. You're right there at the bridge between the east and the west. You control traffic in and out of the Black Sea. So it was a very sound strategic decision to build where he'd built.
Well, we know that because it lasts.
And it did.
Thousands of years.
Yeah, for so long. And to some degree it did because it was such a brilliant location. It was very hard to capture. It was captured, of course, eventually,
right.
But it lasted a long time.
Well after Rome had been sacked on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
And in fact, Constantine moves the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, correct?
He does it, especially his successors move it there.
Okay.
And Rome was proving to be, already even before that, Rome was proving to be kind of a problem. And some emperors had been operating from Milan or from Ravenna because Rome was just not as well located, you know, as a ways from the water. It needed access to the Eastern Mediterranean a little better. So there was good reason to maybe think about moving it someplace else.
So those Germanic tribes that were bothering the western part of the empire, it's not as if the eastern part were completely free of threats, but there must have been far less.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, the poor West, you look at the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, and, you know, the maps and textbooks of all these kind of terrifying colored arrows of Goths and Visigoths and Vandals, and you know, it's a terrifying notion of these barbarians.
That's what you get as a child, like as a grade school.
Exactly. That's right.
The Ostrogoths. And
yeah. And, you know, we have
the Goths,
images,
the Vandals.
And they images of them are terrifying with great drooping mustaches, or at least that's the way the pictures are painted.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, and Rome was much harder to defend. And, you know, the passageways, the geographical passageways were much easier. So Rome was, you know, they were facing some real difficulties with holding those borders. And just the location of Constantinople, you know, there's more water around it and more defensible borders. But you're right, they certainly they had their own enemies, the Persians and the Avars and all these, and another batch of arrows zeroing in on the Eastern Empire as well as the West.
So the Nova Roma, is that Constantine or is that after Constantine? The idea of the new Rome.
Yeah, I think that's after Constantine. Again, he sort of gets credit for it, but I think that was really a little bit later on that they, and even that, for quite a while, the Byzantines, they had, not say an ambiguous relationship with Rome, but Rome still had, there was quite a bit of aura around Rome as the older capital. And, you know, Constantinople had to struggle a bit. Again, one of the reasons why you could say the people of Constantinople spent so much time cultivating stories and traditions and mythologies and even propaganda about the sort of mystical nature, the God-given nature of Constantinople, is because Constantinople had to prove itself as an equivalent to Rome. I'm not sure they would have ever claimed to replace it, but that they would see themselves as sort of, you might say, continuing Rome, but further east.
And it lasted 1,000 years after the fall of the western part of the empire?
It did. Constantinople, yes. So often we talk about the fall of Rome, we really talk about
and that's why I was wondering about that, because sometimes that's the way people view it, that the Roman Empire fell. But that's not really the case, because customs, traditions, and laws were all continuing that were Roman customs, traditions, and laws, but in the eastern part of the empire.
Absolutely. And you could argue in some ways the Roman Empire still isn't entirely gone. You know, think about where the center of Christendom is today, and it's, you know, why? It's because it's Rome. But I think that that's such a good point. We tend to for whatever reason, we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we just concentrate on Rome. And then, of course, the sort of 450 is roughly when we think about that happening. But the truth is that Rome had another 1,000 years and the Byzantines, who eventually we call the Eastern Romans Byzantines, saw themselves very much as Romans. And in fact, their contemporaries called them Romans. So the Roman Empire really lasted up to 1453, not so long ago, when it finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. But it had a long run.
And I always compare that to Columbus's voyage, which isn't less than 50 years after that. Yeah. And I think of the New World and the Old World in those terms. I don't know if I'm correct to do that, but that's how I like to juxtapose those two things.
It's so interesting, isn't it, to think how close. So we have 1492 for Columbus's expedition, and we have 1453 for the end of Rome as a separate thing, within decades of each other. And it's really interesting that talking about how you could say Rome never fell in some ways. Much is made of the Renaissance in Italy, to a large degree being, if not shaped, certainly profoundly influenced by Byzantine exiles fleeing the fall of Rome, bringing their ideas and their texts and their translations and their Plato and Aristotle and to
I'm going to ask you about that later,
which
too.
is so I won't get ahead of ourselves.
No, that's
but
okay.
I mean, that there's the continuity between Rome and the modern age and the Italian Renaissance is pretty apparent.
So when I think of the Byzantine Empire, I always think of Justinian. And maybe that's just how it's taught when you're probably even in college.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Could you explain who Justinian is? And I think he comes to power around 527 CE?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
So 527. So who is Justinian, and why is he so remembered as, I guess, maybe one of the most influential Byzantine emperors?
And there's good reason for that. One is he's fairly early on in the development of an Eastern empire. By that time, the Western Empire had really was no longer a unified empire and had been broken up into competing kings and really tribal chiefs. In Italy, the Lombards, and so there was no longer an emperor in the West. But in the East, of course, they continued, Constantinople being the capital. And so Justinian, coming when he did, had two or three things going for him. One is he lasted a long time. And, that's in some ways, and especially in the ancient world, one of the definitions of a successful king or monarch is just lasting. And so he was
like Ramses,
exactly.
He just lived a long time.
He lived a long time.
So he's the great.
He is the great because he gets to do that. He also was apparently really well assisted by his wife Theodora.
I was going to ask you about
brilliant, his amazing life, and famously gives him some really good advice at crucial points.
Saves him basically.
Saves him, yes, exactly.
Well, saves his
really
power.
Does.
Keeps him in power.
He was ready to run at one point, and she said, "No, I'm
going to ask you about that.
Yeah,
too.
we'll talk about that too." And of course, he's important in the story of Constantinople because he was a great builder. And much is made, recently the Hagia Sophia has been in the news because of its transition from museum back to mosque. But that was originally his church. He built that thing basically to try to recover some of the prestige that he was about to lose when he thought about running away, which we'll talk about in a minute. He built this magnificent church which becomes sort of a symbol of Constantinople because it completely dominates the city, and there's nothing like it. It's this massive, even today after 1,500 years.
I was going to say
breathtaking.
It dominates the landscape today. Imagine what it would have been back in 527 or whenever it was.
So he really was. He kind of sets the stage. He kind of sets the model of what a Byzantine emperor should be, and the close alliance with the church. And then famously Justinian tries to win back the West.
And that's another thing that I think is lost. Those emperors, Justinian is one of them, views himself as the Roman emperor.
Yes.
And he views the entire Roman Empire to be something to be reclaimed. So he sends I think it's Belisarius.
Yeah, that's right.
And he sends him and to recapture North Africa and try to recapture Rome because his view is he's the Roman emperor.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. It really was. Sadly, it was. He worked hard at it, spent lots of money. It was, to some degree, when he died, I think probably was a sigh of relief because he had been a very expensive emperor because of his various projects. But during these years of fighting to try to recapture the West, and he got all the way to Spain, recapturing clear across North Africa, much of North Africa. In the process, a lot of damage was done. Famously, the sort of damaged Rome that we see today in pictures of the knocked down temples and things, so much of that actually was not done by the Ostrogoths and Visigoths and Lombards, but it was actually done by during these Byzantine wars in which constant warfare in which Rome was a battleground. And so, ironically, the Romans did a lot of damage themselves to their legendary capital.
And you mentioned he was a great builder as well, but and I want to talk about that. But going back to Belisarius, so what's his role? Is he just the general at the time, his main general? Yeah,
Belisarius. So apparently a brilliant general, and Justinian relied upon him for a number of years. I think Theodora, apparently Belisarius's wife, was a close confidant of Theodora, so he was in good graces in the imperial couple, and just a very successful general. Eventually, Justinian's really interesting in that there's kind of two Justinians. There's the one Justinian that's the great Roman emperor, who is this great builder and who the sources talk about as this wonderful character. And then we have this really interesting source by Procopius, who was a contemporary who worked for Justinian and Theodora, and he wrote something called The Secret History. And
they do that today, Dr.
It's
Hodel.
Exactly. And this wouldn't be unfamiliar to us from the people who are finished in the White House, going off and writing in their memoirs. And in this one, he just slams Justinian and Theodora, repeatedly sort of suggesting that they're actually demons. According to Procopius's version, again, we have two Procopiuses. We have Procopius who is sort of the fawning courtier, and Procopius who's clearly writing this book late at night secretly, apparently getting all his resentment out on the page. But according to Procopius, eventually Belisarius is seen as a threat by Justinian because he's getting too popular, too successful,
and that
pushes him out.
The one thing about the emperors at that time, well, and it went back to Rome, is they viewed themselves as absolute power. And anybody who's in absolute power, if you have, and this happened with Saddam Hussein and others, when a general especially a general, when they gained popularity, somehow they find their way either being retired or worse.
Yeah, and it's a real issue with Byzantine emperors. One of the things that's always kind of puzzling when you study how one emperor replaces another one in the Byzantine Empire, even the Roman Empire.
I was going to ask you about that too.
How does it? It's not a clear cut. It's not just the children follow the fathers. It's often the successful general or the successful courtier that maybe establishes a dynasty for a reign or two, and then inevitably they are overthrown. So there's a good reason to be fearful of generals.
Yeah, I think you're. In fact, you were saying that of the 80, and I just wrote this little note down. Of the 88 Byzantine Empire emperors, 29 died violently. 13 abandoned their throne and moved to the monastery.
Oh, yeah.
And that's basically because if you don't do that, you're going to die violently.
That's right.
So more than half of them basically have a really not so nice ending.
It's a dangerous job. You wonder why people wanted it. And
a lot of rewards.
I think that was it. It must have been really good. But it was, the Byzantines had an interesting way of dealing with these exiles. Again, because the emperor was supposed to be a divine being, almost, sort of a sacred being, that God's representative on earth, or almost, I'm going to say God's incarnation, but it's on the edge of that almost. The emperor could never be flawed physically. So one of the ways they ensured that these people's political careers really were done is, of course, they sent them to a monastery. But they often would, initially they would slit their nose because then they would be disfigured. And then a much more effective way was they would blind them. And so these emperors who, and this happened a lot, if you had maybe 1 or 2 years on the throne and then you were overthrown. And interesting enough, the people of Constantinople sort of accepted that as evidence that this figure had lost God's favor, and so it was okay that he was overthrown. And then off they went to, there were a couple islands off the coast where there's monasteries where they could put these former emperors to live out their days blind or with no nose. And that was, at the time, it was seen as humane. Slitting somebody's tongue or nose sounds hideous to us, but they weren't killing them was the idea. So according to the rules of the values of the time, that was seen as quite a civilized act.
The idea of projecting strength, obviously for an absolute dictator, makes total sense, but that's not something that's changed over time either. When you were talking about that, it made me think of Adolf Hitler, who never would exercise because he was always afraid it would put him in this like precariously awkward position, or he would look like he was struggling if he was running, or so he would never he would never exercise basically. Yeah. And in fact, he wouldn't even walk up hills when he was at the Berghof. He would go down the hill walking down, so it was effortless.
Sure.
And then they have a car waiting down there, and it was all because of projecting strength. He would not wear or use an umbrella.
Isn't that interesting?
That seeps its way into the modern American military because a male soldier cannot use an umbrella in uniform.
Really?
So there are little vestiges of things like that still around.
Isn't that interesting?
I am wondering, because of the distance and all the problems that had happened in the West, as you mentioned, about 450 or so, because of that distance, they do maintain some of the laws and traditions and teachings. But how does the Eastern Empire develop differently than the West? Because it kind of develops almost as its own type of culture.
It really does. When we talk about Roman history, that as in the history coming out of Rome and the Republic and then the Empire established by Caesar Augustus and later, that is a Rome that has, of course, in part of its history, has conquered Greece, and also because to some degree Rome was even early on influenced heavily by Greece, because that was sort of the cultural center of the Eastern Mediterranean. Right. It took on all these Greek ideas, famously the gods, the Roman gods, Greek gods are the same, just different names and that sort of thing. So there always was this Greek influence.
Architecture looks very similar.
Absolutely. But the Romans, of course, made much of their legal tradition and their sense of civic duty, which was an important thing, their gravitas. So there was a kind of hard-headed Romanness, the Roman administrator, the magnificent Roman engineers that build roads straight across their territories. So that was a kind of a major feature where Greek civilization was seen as part of their educational structure, but not necessarily essential to being a good ruler. That is, particularly being sensitive to Greek tradition. When the empire became more Greek, and that's really what happened with Byzantine Empire. It was just that it moved towards the east. It became more Greek and less Roman.
Greek, right?
Exactly, and in time they spoke Greek, though they continued to use both languages. But more and more it was Greek, and as time went by, then Greek civilization really came to, the sort of hard-headed Roman administration was always there, but it became more shaped by sort of Greek mystical tradition, the sort of appreciation of sort of the irrational even, and to some degree, and sort of it shows up a bit in some of the Greek myths and that sort of thing, which then feeds into Eastern Orthodox Christianity, because it tends to be a little more mystical, a little more sort of, famously that their churches are are, with the exception of the Hagia Sophia, they're small enclosed space. So it's very much an internal religious experience as opposed to an outward expression, what you see like in the Western Gothic tradition. So they really do, that really shows up. But by the same token, it's still got this Roman foundation. So one of the great achievements of Justinian, who we were talking about before, is he codified all these laws.
That was my next question,
good.
actually.
Yeah, because it's a really important thing. But I'll let you ask the question.
Well, I just thought, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but he's savvy enough. You mentioned, Constantine was savvy, but Justinian must have been as well.
Very savvy, yeah.
And he realizes he's got a very complex empire, especially with the new land that he takes control of. Yeah. He's got to figure out a way to govern that. And his scholars come up with the Justinian Code. So maybe you can explain you were just talking about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in many ways, one of his most long-lasting achievements, because
900 years.
Absolutely. It certainly had its influence on later codes. So my understanding is the Roman law, a lot of it, especially during the empire, was made by Roman emperors. So it might be what we call, forgive me if I hope that legal experts listening this aren't going to jump on this, but to some degree, it seems like it was sort of precedent that a Roman emperor would establish a law, and then later Roman emperors would more or less follow that law, especially in terms of sort of civil law and ownership and inheritance and those kinds of things. So there was this vast body of complicated information, and it was really hard to keep track of. And then there were different parts of the empire, so there were slight differences. So one of the things Justinian did is he put together a group of scholars under a great jurist, Tribonian, I think was his name, to try to bring it all together into one big code, one big book. And then the process, they also kind of came up with a textbook so that people could actually learn to study this thing, because it had just gotten too messy after hundreds and hundreds of years. And then the Justinian Code then becomes one of the main features in medieval Europe. They pick up the Justinian Code, and it becomes the foundation of law in Germany and France and elsewhere, because it was this good, solid Roman law.
I think his advancements are the real reason. And it's not just his, because there are several people that follow him. And it wasn't him that came up with the Justinian Code.
No.
And so those scholars and Justinian, they increased the fortifications of Constantinople, kind of reformed the military. And with the new Justinian Code, those two things together solidify the empire in a way that Rome couldn't have possibly been solidified.
That's such a good point. I think it really, especially if you're trying to unify something and trying to streamline it and try to make it manageable, you need good law codes. And one of the reasons that the empire lasted as long as it did is because it had good administration. That really was, you see all the challenges they're facing during that period, but they managed to hold together, and a lot of it was they had good, smart administrators, well-educated, and they had this law code. Is your point well taken?
And to Justinian's credit, somebody who has absolute power to relinquish that thought, to give over to the scholars the ability to empower them to create the code, he deserves credit for that.
He does deserve credit. And, he picked good people. He was good at picking good people, so he picked the right ones and he supported them. It was very serious. Of course, he expected to have his name on it, which of course it is. But that's, that's right. That's right. That's exactly. Probably not. So, he gets credit for that. And he deserves it. I think that's true. And he did leave a well-organized system.
Okay. So now it sounds like Justinian is just cruising along, and he's created the code, the economy's better, he's captured a lot of the Roman Empire, but things don't always go well for Justinian.
They don't. And of course, the big one is the plague, which apparently was just devastating. And we think it was the first appearance of the bubonic plague, which is going to show up again and again and again. And poor old Constantinople got hit more than once with that.
That's the thing. I was going to ask you about that too, because this idea of a global pandemic, it's something that's happened in human history over and over again. And Constantinople specifically is hit incredibly hard right at the end of Justinian's time, and then reoccurring for the next few hundred years at least.
Yeah, it was. I mean, that it's hard to get the numbers on these things, but a third to a half of the city's population, and it's also, again, back to why Constantinople was so successful, is because it was such a good trading center. So all this wealth was coming in because there they were, the bridge between East and West. But the flip side is that's where all the diseases, of course, came through as well. So
people coming in from all over the place.
Yeah,
it is perfectly positioned for that type of economic exchange. Yeah. But as you mentioned, that's not the only thing that gets exchanged.
No, that's right. So that was pretty rough. And so it's at the same time we have these invasions, these wars. Justinian keeps fighting these endless wars, and you can imagine an army is very prone to not just the dysentery and sort of traditional diseases that went with armies, but the plague. So it was by the time Justinian went, his empire, certainly the population was greatly reduced and weakened.
We haven't given Theodora enough her due.
We haven't. We need to talk about it.
And so Theodora, I always think about her. She did a lot of different things. She was a diplomat, a great advisor, especially during the Nika Rebellion. Could you explain the Nika Rebellion,
Sure.
Justinian's position, and then Theodora?
Yeah. Well, she's such an interesting character. And, it gets to, when you talk about the Nika Rebellion, it's a chance to talk about some of the sort of strange features of Byzantine civilization, but by the same time, very familiar, like sports. The obsession with sports was big. And of course, for the Byzantines, it was chariot racing, which was a huge thing. And
so he builds this huge.
He did.
We mentioned him being a great builder, and one of the buildings that I would always associate with Constantinople was the Hippodrome.
Yes.
So maybe you can since you touched on it.
Sure.
Explain how they use the Hippodrome.
And it is, you go to Istanbul today, and you have to, beyond the Hagia Sophia, you have to look a little bit to find evidence of the Byzantine Empire. It's been pretty well, when the Turks came in, they knocked down the Grand Palace and put up the Blue Mosque. And I mean, in recent years, 50 years, 100 years, there's been lots of archaeology. So you can go underneath and you can see these things. But one of the things that is surviving is the Hippodrome. There's this vast space, and most of the stone is gone, but is this gigantic horse racing area that has had monuments in the middle of it. And so it was apparently just absolutely wild horse race. I think those of us who've ever seen, from the great Ben-Hur, I was the one that comes to mind, where apparently they reenacted, they did the whole thing with real horses and charioteers. But anyway, a very important part of someone's identity in Constantinople was the chariot color. So there were the blues and the greens and the whites and the reds. And in the end, it was just the blues and the greens. And they were so powerful, they tended to sort of turn into kind of mafia-like operations, but they were fan clubs for the most part. And one of the things, and back to your point about how even Hitler had to be conscious of maintaining support, even dictators and those of absolute power in the Byzantine Empire had to still keep the mob on their side. And the mob could actually overthrow them. More than once, actually, the mob was active. So you would never call the Byzantines democratic, but they certainly had to be aware of public opinion. Anyway, in this context, the mob agitated, I think it had to do with taxation, and so they were demanding reform. And the Hippodrome, of course, was a great place to meet. It was this huge space, and the city rose up in revolt, burnt down various buildings, burnt down the original Hagia Sophia, and Justinian thought he probably should leave, that his life was in danger, and so he was actually getting ready to leave when Theodora, his companion, said, "Well, something to the effect the purple robes of the emperor make a good funeral shroud. So I'm gonna stay here.
Yeah, I think she said things like, "Well, you can get out if you want. There's plenty of water.
That's right.
You can get out of
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
but
Yeah,
the purple
that's
robes,
right.
and
Purple
even
robes.
if you do get out, you're going to wish you had died."
Absolutely. You can imagine there's a whole really good dialogue that we don't have access to between the two of them. So he decided to stay, and eventually Belisarius brings in the troops and trap the mob in the Hippodrome and massacre them. So that's the way he deals with that, and so he stays. And then as a result of those fires and a result of the kind of humiliation of this, he builds the Hagia Sophia to sort of show that he actually was great after all. But Theodora is fantastic because she started off life as a circus performer. Now, what that means today is kind of hard to grasp. Some might call her a prostitute, courtesan. In any case, there's a sort of tradition of her having a very checkered past. But she clearly was brilliant and won over the complete devotion of Justinian, and they ruled together. And she was, this is one example, and there are others of her being a really tough, smart leader.
There's no question she was tough there.
Tough, no question.
And it saves Justinian.
It does. It saves Justinian. Yeah, I'm not sure how much we want to applaud massacring the population, but it was.
He maintained power.
He'd maintained power. That's right. Exactly.
So how opulent, because you said he was a builder, and I might be, you hear these stories when I was younger and so forth, that he had these golden lions that they created some sort of audible roar. So when people would approach, he would have them roar and they would immediately fall to their knees. Golden trees and golden birds around him. Is that all accurate? Or
it seems to be, I mean, in addition to tremendous wealth and brilliant administrators, the Byzantines were good at technology. And again, one of the reasons they managed to last so long is because they were masters at using all these things, again, to enhance that aura of the Byzantine emperor as the really the one true autocrat on earth that everyone should pay respects to. But there's a tradition, and apparently for many years, that he had a throne room. It may have been later emperors, especially. I forget which ones on this exactly. But through some sort of apparently a steam process, there were these. The idea was that the ambassador would arrive, and there would be the emperor sitting on his throne, and he'd push some sort of a button or something, and these lions would roar. And then, if that wasn't enough, then there were mechanical birds that would start tweeting and singing. And then, as the emperor, no doubt, sort of at this point, shaking in his shoes, a bit like coming before the great Oz, and would fall down on his knees, and he would look up, and there was some kind of device in the throne that would make the throne raise up in the air, so that when he looked at the emperor once, he was at one level, and he looked again, and he was higher in the air. And then, even more dramatic, there was some sort of a machine in which there was a quick change, and he could change clothing. So while the ambassador was down on his knees and the emperor was wearing a purple robe, he looked up and he was wearing a green robe or something like that. So the effect was really dramatic. So, and again, to some degree, this is calculated on the part of the Byzantines.
Oh, no question.
How do you keep barbarians, massive armies away from the walls? Well, you give the impression that this is no mere city. This is a special place.
So you mentioned on a few occasions the Hagia Sophia. Could you explain its history? I know that there had been a church there, and then it was destroyed during the Nika Rebellion, and then Justinian builds. When Justinian builds, is that the lasting Hagia Sophia that we see today?
So it is.
That's amazing.
It's amazing.
That's it's just AD to today, and it still stands.
It is amazing. Even now, it's breathtaking. You look at this thing and you think this thing has been here 1,500 years. It's extraordinary. Again, we talked earlier about how he was brilliant at picking good people. He chose not architects, but two mathematicians, and clearly he made the right choice to build this thing. He wanted it built very quickly. I seem to be like 8 or 10 years. It's amazing to see how quickly it constructed.
Comparing that to some of the other cathedrals in the medieval time, 100, right?
Yeah, so this thing was really put up fast. And of course, it has this dome that appears to float in space, way up into the sky. And that was sort of the tradition, was that the Hagia Sophia was a magical building with this great dome. Because domes apparently are really hard to construct because they tend to collapse inside. And then part of this also is you have to take account that Constantinople is built on a fault, and there are earthquakes. So that had to be a consideration as well. And the dome has collapsed a couple times and been reconstructed. But it's this fantastic structure. It's a really kind of a giant square with this huge dome and then smaller domes around it. And it's really one big room. It's very different from, when we think of sort of other churches, there might be chapels and side sections, sacristies and stuff. And this is really one big, massive room. And of course, it was encrusted with mosaic, which was sort of a special Byzantine artistic tradition. Again, a good choice because, mosaics can dazzle the eye with sunlight or through candlelight because of the gold. And so encrusted with golden mosaics and the massive images of the Virgin Mary and Christ. Apparently, people would go in there, would just knock their socks off. And again, it was all part of the impression that Constantinople was the city.
I always considered the Hagia Sophia, as it was supposed to be, the greatest church that was ever constructed. It
really was, yeah. And it was the greatest church for 1,000 years, I think, until I think the current St. Peter's is bigger. But until that was built, and that wasn't until the 16th century, I think the Hagia Sophia, was the largest church.
So I have a question for you. We talked about their emphasis on the Greco-Roman culture.
Yes.
Teaching the classics, the architecture. What do we owe the Byzantines for protecting that history for modern time?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that so much. So so much of the philosophy that we have, Plato, Aristotle, and a host of the lesser-known philosophers, historians, religious text, but certainly anything we have from the pre-Christian era, we really have, to a large degree, thanks to the Byzantines, because they kept them and translated them. And of course, there are monasteries in the West that were doing that too, but that was certainly one of the things monks did in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, was preserve these texts. And again, back to earlier we talked about the Italian Renaissance. It was then these Byzantines carrying these texts over to Italy in the 15th century that then introduced the Western Europeans, especially to Plato. There's a good example. The West in the Middle Ages knew about Plato, but they only had one or two of his books. And they weren't even very typical books. And it was not really until the Byzantines introduced the Italians to the other, I'm not sure how many other books it's in that list, but let's say 25 to 30 books. That's really because the Byzantines carried those books to the West with them and introduced then the Italians to them. So I think the same thing with Herodotus. As part of the introduction we made is I think Herodotus existed for the most part in a Byzantine copy of the original.
Wow. And this next question, we could probably spend an entire hour, if not a whole semester, on this question. But what impact does that split of the empire, the Byzantine Empire, have on Christianity?
Well,
if you can, in a minute or so.
Sure. No, that's a great question. They started off, and there are all these ecumenical councils, and the Nicaea, that was in the Byzantine Empire. We know about that one, and Constantinople and other places.
It's important to remember that as well.
It is.
As you mentioned, that was in the Byzantine Empire.
It was. And so initially the two churches were pretty close, but tensions over centuries, and of course that's always a thing you look at the Byzantines. We're dealing with centuries upon centuries. There was always a tension between the leadership of the two cities, and the Pope supposedly had preeminence over the patriarch in Constantinople. So that created attention to the leadership of the church. Also, that I mentioned earlier, there was a little different orientation towards a worldview or a religious view, where the East tended to be a little bit more mystical in some of its thinking, as opposed to the West was a little more theological. And so other divisions along those lines gradually opened up until the two traditions really went in different directions. And there was issues about leavened bread versus unleavened bread, and the appropriate fingers to use and crossing. I mean, these things don't seem terribly important to us now, but deeply important then. And so by the 11th century, the two churches were really going in different directions and really were becoming confrontational. And then when things, at least looking back today, a real turning point was when Constantinople was captured by the Fourth Crusade. So here you have Latin Christians attacking, and that's a whole other really interesting story how that happened. But anyway, they captured Constantinople, sacked it, carried off a lot of its holy relics and treasures to the west. And of course, nowadays, if you talk to especially some from the Greek Orthodox tradition, they're very much aware of that seeming act of treachery by the Latin Church. And so, they after that, periodically, they tried to get back together again. The Byzantines were even willing to think about reuniting with the Western tradition to get help against the Ottoman Turks that we know eventually did take them over. But it was really hard for them to do it. They just couldn't bring themselves to do it. The animosity was so great between the two.
So you mentioned the Crusades, and that is another conversation entirely. But what happens in Constantinople from the First Crusade? Because I know in the First Crusade, 3 armies of knights and pilgrims showed up outside the gates, so it wasn't just the Fourth. So throughout those Crusades, what happens in Constantinople? Because aren't they the crossover point to get to the Middle East? And
you made such a good point by bringing those up. We talk about the Fourth Crusade, where a crusade actually captures Constantinople. But for the previous 100 years, the previous 3 crusades, almost all of them, I think, went through there. So the Byzantines had to deal with these huge armies of crusaders. We're talking about medieval army. In some ways, they're like a medieval city. So you have soldiers, but then you have a whole host of family members and priests and suttors, and there's massive numbers. And the Byzantines dealt then with these rapacious, really hungry crusaders that had just walked clear across Europe to get there.
These are tough characters.
And they're tough characters. They're tough, ferocious characters. And so there were a lot of clashes before the Fourth Crusade between Constantinople and the Byzantines and the Crusaders again and again. And, later Crusaders, Frederick Barbarossa, the great German emperor crusader, at one point basically blackmailed the Byzantines and trying to get money out of them to pay for his crusades. So there was plenty of bad blood before the Fourth Crusade occurred. But yeah, so the poor Byzantines had to deal with this constant flow of smelly, obnoxious, aggressive, angry, ferocious crusaders.
I'm sure the popes were happy to get rid of those characters.
That's true.
Send them to the
That's
Byzantines.
Exactly. It's good. I'm sure you can just imagine some of the clerics wiping their brows to get rid of some local swaggering knight, send him off to the Holy Land, get him out of town.
Their problems didn't end with the rise of Islam. Maybe touch upon the rise of Islam starts taking away and eroding the Byzantine Empire, and eventually it's only Constantinople that remains.
Yeah. It's, of course, in the 7th century, Muhammad begins his ministry, and it spreads like wildfire very, very quickly in the Middle East. And up until that time, much of the Middle East had been controlled by the Byzantine Empire. So it was a direct threat to their territory. And eventually the Arabs besieged Constantinople more than once, and of course eventually failed to take it. But the emergence of Islam does see Byzantine territory reduced. It's a back and forth thing. At certain periods, the Byzantines win back territory. And initially, the Byzantines were happy to have Crusaders show up because they hoped to use them to win back some of that lost territory. But yeah, they lose a big section of their empire, and eventually, there are various Islamic groups that dominate the Middle East. There's the Abbasids and the Fatimids. We know them from the names of these great sultans, and that's the last great Islamic movement that dominated the Middle East was the Ottoman Empire that showed up in the 13th, 14th century. And they based their power really by being sort of border warriors, by fighting on the edges of Islam to expand the empire. And that meant that they were right up against the Byzantine Empire. And they even got very quickly into Europe. So that one of the things that really led to the collapse was they lost their territory to the Ottoman Turks until eventually 1453, literally all that was left was the city of Constantinople, a little bit in Greece and the Peloponnese and a few islands, but they had so dramatically shrunk. And to some degree, it really was the rise of Islam and other factors, but that weakened them dramatically.
Well, they had a great run.
They had a great run, didn't they? Yeah, isn't that the truth? To last that long, and then to last that long, especially, we talk about the sacking of Constantinople in 1204, but it lasted another 350 years. So they were masters at survival. They knew how to do that.
So what happens at the very end? 1453?
Yes, yeah.
With the Ottoman Turks.
So a very aggressive young sultan, Mahmud, known as Muhammad the Conqueror, was determined to capture Constantinople, and there had been earlier attempts to capture it. Again, back to the sort of technological genius of the Byzantine Empire, they had something called Greek fire that they could, it sounds like sort of napalm, like subjects they could shoot out of hoses and lighting other ships. So that was one of the things that kept them at bay. But eventually, they'd lost their navy.
That was used in Game of Thrones.
I bet it was. Yeah, it had to have been. I can imagine. Yeah, and it was kind of Byzantine. Isn't there one of the cities in that?
So even HBO
Byzantine,
owns the Byzantine.
I think that's
they
probably
they
true.
owe the Byzantines.
They
also.
do exactly. Yes, exactly right. So they. He was determined to capture it and surmount the failures of his predecessors, and even then it was a really hard fight. I think it was a 60, 70-day siege, and he had to bring in massive artillery to knock down the walls, and there were lots and lots of bloody failed attacks on the city. But finally, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the 11th, famously dies on the walls of Constantinople, or again, depending on what you think, he went into hiding and is sleeping underneath the city, and will come back one day once the Greeks recapture it, whatever version, and then Muhammad then captures it, sacks the city for 2 or 3 days. That was the way you paid armies then, but stopped it because he didn't want to completely destroy the city. He's a very interesting character in that he, even while determined to capture Constantinople, he captured it because he also admired it and admired the tradition. So, for instance, the Hagia Sophia was
Didn't he drop to his knees or something?
He did.
That's what I was.
Yeah.
He gets to the Hagia Sophia.
He gets the Hagia Sophia and, thanks Allah for this great victory. And also, to some degree, says he's sort of horrified at the consequences of the city being captured as well, and stops the destruction and the looting. And from that point on, famously the Turks are tolerant of the Christian population that survived, and the Patriarch was allowed to stay. But of course, in time, Constantinople is turned into the capital of the Ottoman Empire, for the same reason it was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It's brilliantly located, east and west, right there on a bridge, it's worth visiting today, not just for the Byzantine remnants, but the Ottoman structures and palaces are pretty magnificent as well.
And they referred to it as Constantinople.
They did quite often. They played with the name a bit. Istanbul, it seems to me in Turkish it's something like the city. Or
it was
something,
something about the old Greek name or something.
Yeah.
That's what they kind of referenced the old Greek name for the
that's probably true. And they, because they were, even now to some degree, the Turks see themselves as the heir of Rome. That they, granted they captured Constantinople, but they made it their capital as well. And, again, to some degree, participating in the tradition of the great city.
Because they didn't destroy everything.
They didn't destroy everything at all. No, they and even one of the reasons today Hagia Sophia is so interesting is the Turks didn't. Some cities they did pull down the mosaics and the images and that sort of thing, but they, for the most part, whitewashed them in the Hagia Sophia, so they were preserved. So when the Hagia Sophia was turned into a museum in the 20th century, the Turks, all they had to do was take off the paint, and there were the magnificent mosaics we see today.
I always found that amazing too, that imagery, because that is close to abhorrent.
Isn't that something?
In Islamic tradition.
It is amazing that they were, and I think if you look at the other churches, Constantinople was full of churches when it was a Christian city, 300, something like that. And they're still there, though most of them have been turned into mosques, and some have been knocked down as well. And a lot of those actually, a lot of the mosaics are really gone. But not all of them, and quite a few of them actually have, thanks to the Turks, sort of awareness that they wanted to get rid of it, but they didn't want to destroy it, which is interesting, isn't it? And their attitude towards the Byzantines is they were distrustful of their Christianity, but they still respected the sort of works of their hands, and they wanted to preserve those things. So
just recently, they redesignated the Hagia Sophia back to a mosque. What impact is that going to have in the near future?
Well, it's such
for Turkey, and not only for the just the cultural part of it, but just the relationship with the West.
It's a big question. It's the Hagia Sophia, I think, is the most visited site in Turkey, so it's a huge tourist draw.
It's got to be one of the most visited sites in the entire world.
Probably is, and of course, it's a World Heritage List site and all those kinds of things. So it's a really, really important place. I think it's been appreciated for years as this kind of neutral territory too. Here you have Christian imagery. Once it was turned into a museum, then the old mosaics were exposed, but the Turks also left these great discs that go around the middle of on the walls of the Hagia Sophia that are Islamic images. So you have this wonderful juxtaposition of 18th century Islamic decoration along with Byzantine Christian decoration. And so it really felt like
such an important lesson,
like a bridge, a lesson, that here was this neutral territory that religions could live next to each other. And of course it fit perfectly with Ataturk, who was the great Turkish president dictator who really sort of created modern Turkey. So the point he was trying to make was to sort of de-Islamicize Turkey. He felt that Islam was, to some degree, limiting its participation in the West. So he wanted to turn this into a museum. Erdogan, of course, had been in power now 17 years, struggling a little bit to stay in power and really feeling he needed to feed his base.
That doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen. Doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? And so the idea was there's been calls for years, but never serious ones really, to turn it back into a mosque. And so this act is really popular amongst his base.
Really just to consolidate his power.
Exactly. That really is. So we'll see what happens. I understand that the Christian imagery now is covered with curtains when it's being used as a mosque, and then when it's open to the public, they open the curtains up. So they're trying to walk a kind of tightrope of museum and mosque. We hope that goes okay.
I would like to thank our guest today, Dr. Patrick Hotle, for the enlightening and interesting story of the ancient city of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. The featured beer was Schnickelfritz. That's a difficult.
It is. It was good, though. It was very good.
It's a Bavarian-style Weiss beer from the Urban Chestnut Brewing Company. Remember to subscribe to the History A Go-Go podcast, like our Facebook page, leave a review or a comment for your chance to win a Hy-Vee gift card. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, and you can get their music on Amazon, Spotify, or wherever you download your music. And just to recap, it's Istanbul, not Constantinople today.
Right. That's right.
Join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.